Hi everyone, welcome back to Giant Talk, the world's first OKR podcast and now longest running OKR podcast. I'm very, very pleased to have with us a very special guest today. As you all know, I'm Roger. I'm the founder and chairman of There Be Giants. And today I have Kyle Byrd with us. Now, I was really keen to talk to Kyle because he's been hands-on with OKRs for quite a while, actually, having in particular used them at Atlassian, and in fact worked with Atlassian's clients who've used them, and also has been involved with how Atlassian have used them themselves. So, I'm sure Kyle's going to have some really interesting experiences and insights to share with us. So welcome to Giant Talk, Kyle.
Thanks, Roger. Yeah, super excited to be here.
Great. So tell us a bit about you and where you are, because obviously people can tell from your accent you're not where I am. But yeah, just a bit about you, really.
Yeah, absolutely. So right now I'm based in Austin, Texas. I started my career as a product designer, just working on agile teams. And then I jumped at the chance to go and work for a startup here in Austin called AgileCraft. So AgileCraft was focused at the time. I joined in early 2016, and we were focused on just thinking about how kind of agility expands into the enterprise, and so not just kind of at this team level, but into the levels of the organization. And so I moved out to Austin, Texas, started working with AgileCraft, where I started to learn a ton about this space. And specifically at the time, if you remember back in those days, Sched Agile framework was really kind of on the rise, and that was kind of very much so our focus. And so I was at AgileCraft for about 3.5 years before we were acquired by Atlassian. And so we saw all kinds of things, different waves of kind of in the agile space and moving into OKRs. At that time, we got acquired by Atlassian. And so I spent the last 3.5 years really focused on outcome-driven organizations that we can talk a bit about. And then more recently, just a few months ago in September, I left Atlassian, where I was a senior product manager for about 3.5 years, kind of working on tools for OKRs, among other things, to start focusing on a bit more of a general problem around outcome-driven organizations, which is decision making, which I think is a big piece within OKRs specifically. So that brings us to today.
It's really interesting that your sort of progression has come from has gone all the way through sort of agile into OKRs, and now potentially, by the sounds of your new venture, perhaps beyond that. Do you think there's a common thread that runs through all that for you?
100%. I think the biggest thing that we saw, especially when, and regardless, I know some people, when you kind of get back to the manifesto and even if you kind of like dig into the Scaled Agile, is that there's kind of components to this outcome driven mindset and these kind of cycle times that you can get with learning. But I would argue I really didn't kind of see a lot of those common themes until I started working with organizations that were digging into OKRs, and especially more kind of general is really how do they drive different conversations around outcomes and kind of provide environments to pivot and persevere on investments and things like that. So I think kind of the common thread, especially working with outcome-driven organizations, when we kind of start to get towards decision making, is I think we're kind of, with a lot of organizations, there's really been this focus on kind of executional excellence and the cycle time of delivery. Yeah. I think we're kind of starting to get into, okay, well, what's the cycle time that we get after that? Once we get something into market and we've learned something or we were surprised by something, what's the, we got from point A to point B from a delivery perspective, and what's that next piece? I think what we learned with OKRs is it does a great job of kind of providing alignment and focus and understanding what point B is and what the world looks like when we get there, and the evidence that we might see when we're successful. But I think there's kind of a cycle time there right in between where we're learning and we're making decisions and how that impacts the conversations we're having around those goals.
Yeah, it's. I mean, what I'm hearing is that you saw a you had a real realization perhaps when you saw that how OKRs were used in driving or helping to deliver again strategic decision making. But
Absolutely.
I think, and I completely agree with you. I think there's a lot of agile principles and practices that work really well when they're used with OKRs. But I think for leadership, there's a real challenge between creating some stability and some continuity, but whilst at the same time still preserving the right to adapt and change as is necessary sometimes, isn't there?
Absolutely. That's the tough thing, right? Especially you see some of the challenges with OKRs where there's this kind of balance between providing alignment and focus and communicating strategy, but not solutioning kind of too high, right, in the levels of the organization. And so you see that as like a super, super common problem. And I think that's kind of an evolution. A lot of it's cultural, 100% get that. And I think that's always going to be a challenge as far as like, how do you really, we dealt with this a lot when we were working on, we come from the perspective of building tools for OKRs, right? And looking at what's the problem that we're really kind of trying to solve in those conversations. And a lot of that was the relationship between, the OKRs that we're trying to achieve and defining what success looks like, et cetera. And then we have the things that we're doing that we believe are going to get there, that we believe are going to kind of move the needle on those OKRs. But what's really difficult is getting into a position where you've defined those investments, defined those work. Awesome if OKRs really kind of helped define that, and you're kind of looking through them as a lens for how you do resourcing and how you're looking at looking at your investment portfolio and the things that you're focused on. What's more difficult is, of course, now as that continues, is having that environment of, okay, well, it's easy for us to kind of slide back into, these projects just kind of continue to run on forever. It's much more difficult to then go and say, well, how do we start having actual kind of pivot, persevere conversations around those things that we're investing in based on what we're seeing, and kind of treating those things as, look, we're operating in a world of extreme uncertainty. How do we treat those things as really hypotheses that we're really going to move the needle? And how do we have those new conversations kind of in that intersection? I think is really difficult. And of course, difficult as, you start to, as you kind of start to traverse the levels, right? You go to different altitudes of the organization. Those are different conversations that are happening. Obviously, it's a bit easier when it comes to lower levels of the organization, where you might have much more sensitive metrics and you're kind of having those conversations on a much kind of tighter cadence versus high level of the organization where it's really tough, and especially even politically, right? All sorts of things are involved when it comes to potentially pivoting away from a specific investment, canceling it altogether, right? It's really tough to have the tools in place to be able to do that.
It is. And, like when you introduce emotion into it, you can have something someone's had as their baby for a long time, and all of a sudden they have to let go of it.
Exactly.
Anyway, that's aside, because I think it's a whole different rabbit hole we could get lost down there. Yeah. Just kind of coming back on to the conversation around OKRs. So I'm curious, when did you actually get hands-on with OKRs for the first time?
Yeah. So my story here, again, I started with really thinking about building products or solutions for OKRs, even before really, myself and my teams kind of started using it ourselves. So this is back when I was at AgileCraft. We're working with a lot of organizations, mostly organizations that are kind of looking to implement things like Scale Agile Framework or less, or frameworks like that for kind of enterprise agility, which I think is, a bit unique. So from a hands-on perspective, I kind of came across OKRs in early 2018 because I remember when Measure What Matters kind of came out, and I was like, oh, this is what these customers are talking about, right? It goes from just kind of doing interviews and trying to really kind of figure out like what this thing is and why they're trying to do it to it kind of paints a full picture. I'd been interviewing quite a few tech companies at the time, just because we had a bunch of customers who were big banks and insurance and telecoms and things like that, right? This is the whole kind of digital transformation journey. But I was talking trying to talk to a bunch of just software native customers and trying to kind of understand the things that they were doing, just a totally different journey as part of that. So I remember I was actually, and they're pretty public about their use of OKRs, but I remember interviewing folks at Eventbrite and Tableau, and they were saying kind of their entire planning process was really starting, or at least in these pieces of the org, were starting with OKRs. And so it wasn't just this wasn't just like a like to have bolt-on feature, but really the entire process really hinged on defining these outcomes up front and really kind of tracking around progress towards those outcomes. And so we, at the time, we supported goals and objectives and KPIs kind of in the product and in AgileCraft at the time. But it was, different. It wasn't kind of like truly at the center. These OKRs were really kind of like the real definition of success, and they told a story, and they actually drove the investment decisions, as opposed to, you always saw kind of these strategic goals that just kind of ended up being like a label on a piece of work, right? It wasn't something that was really kind of driving the conversation. Look, I'm sure there's orgs out there, that had really good goals and KPIs at this time and similar things. But, I don't remember really coming across just a truly outcome driven conversation until like OKRs were in the picture. So at that time, I really just read everything I could. And we really started digging into like what an outcome driven organization looked like. I think over that time, we tried to keep that very general. We tried to think about it as like, what are these outcome driven organizations that are not focused on time, on budget, right? Outputs. And what are the conversations that they're having and the tools that they're using in order to have those conversations. So at the time we were really kind of a scaled agile focused company. And most of these orgs that I worked with, even though they were kind of in this transformation, they really were very, very project centric and output driven orgs. So I think in my mind, it was a very clear moment in time, where we saw something that felt different and saw new conversations happening in those orgs.
I remember the first time I kind of encountered outcomes, if you will, or certainly goals being framed as outcomes, and that was back in program management, not projects but program management. And this was back in about 15 years ago, I think it was. But to be fair, it took me quite a while to get my head around the difference between outcome and output, and really kind of feel comfortable articulating, outcome over output. And I think, that's why I have some sympathy with people who and teams as well who find this shift in mindset quite challenging at times. And
absolutely.
When you look at for instance, the most widely used goal setting acronym that there has been, I think, ever was SMART, wasn't it? And that just doesn't touch upon outcomes at all, really.
Right.
It certainly doesn't. Well, it could do, but it doesn't encourage the user to in any particular way. And I just don't think we were conditioned to do it, to think in terms of outcomes. We're conditioned to be busy in organizations, aren't we? And to prove being busy. So, as long as we tick something off on our list, then that's fine. So, but as you saw, you've been kind of working with or been involved with OKRs, whether that be within Atlassian or whether in the clients' organizations for quite a number of years. And I'm interested to hear whether you've seen their use evolve at all. Have you seen how organizations have used them change in that time in any way? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I don't necessarily think all very positive. I do think to your point, which is really, really interesting as far as we're really not kind of conditioned to operate in this way, is that as OKRs have kind of evolved, that has a really major impact. And I think there's kind of probably two things there. One of which is that obviously managerial styles have changed, right? You used to have a kind of single person that might understand, right, the entirety of of the business, or and of a pretty large business as well, that you really kind of had this level of the organization that was just, kind of producing outputs, right? And I think we're now in a world of really extreme uncertainty and operating in uncertainty, and we really haven't kind of been in that position before. And so I do think it's really tough to actually, kind of unlearn a lot of that conditioning. And that's why I think I don't necessarily think they've evolved necessarily well, mostly because as OKRs has kind of grown and gotten into more organizations, is it tends to, as opposed to, kind of starting with the problem and then go looking for, something that can kind of help, match that problem. It tends to be the other way around as far as you tend to kind of get the halo effect, right? Another organization is doing OKRs, well, we should do that too, or else are we missing out on something, right? Yeah, exactly. And so I think what you said actually, plays a big role in why, that OKRs kind of tend to start to be manipulated to kind of fit the existing structures of the organizations, as opposed to kind of looking at it as something, well, we need to change what's something that we can kind of set up the scaffolding to get us there. But really the first course of action is that we want to be more outcome driven, as opposed to we're just going to go in and bolt on OKRs. And so I do think these things tend to naturally dilute into or transform into something that's a bit more kind of command and control. And it starts to end up being, kind of super religious and losing focus on kind of the reasons we're implementing these things to begin with. And so I do think if we kind of go back to, it'd be interesting to hear what you think about kind of what these pieces are. But I think if we think about like why, they exist, and especially kind of early on, there are a few things that I think they do incredibly well. And even in organizations today, and some of those things are like, for example, providing focus and alignment, starting to communicate strategy kind of down through the levels, and not solutioning, and then just kind of creating an environment where, learning and pivoting are encouraged and not necessarily kind of the, getting to the output. I think the first one, today, I feel like the first one when organizations kind of come in and implement OKRs, that providing focus and alignment and kind of a new way to communicate is really evident. And I think as you kind of go down that stack, it's much more difficult, right? Then you see in an organization, as far as communicating strategies, you still do see solutioning, and OKRs kind of become a facade of kind of cascading that down. And then the last one, I really don't know if we've I've seen, kind of in small teams and groups, et cetera, but kind of really having those conversations where it's not necessarily about achieving the OKR as much as it is, that is the guardrails for us to have these different conversations around, should we pivot against this thing, or should we just stop this thing, or what are we learning, or what were we surprised by? And does that change what we believe about this in general? I think that's tough to get to. So I do think from an evolution perspective, I do think naturally these things are going to just kind of be used or manipulated as kind of a bolt-on, where some of the things that would initially have to change just haven't, whether that's cultural or whether that's, there's really still not, a lot of health on even kind of the agility or execution side. I think there's just a lot of pieces. And so, but I think like as far as OKRs as a framework in general is as strong as ever. I just think some things have changed as far as, what we see when it's being implemented in organizations.
Yeah, I mean, there's some really interesting things, the points that you touch on there, and in particular, the fact that you've got cyclical learning and pivoting, and that requires some rather courageous questions to be asked, doesn't it? And as I said before, if it's been your baby and you've been nursing it and nurturing it and growing it for however long, it can be really, really painful to let go of that and move on to something else. So there's a whole sort of emotional side, which, gets into the psychology of it all and so on.
Yep.
So there's some really, it's interesting that you say, you've seen some sort of examples of OKRs being sort of defaulting or going back to sort of command and control. I think there's, again, it comes back down to conditioning, doesn't it? I feel like I'm going off on a real tangent here, but I wonder if it's got something to do with education.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's a certain amount of conditioning that is kind of ingrained into us from our education that we have to kind of undo. Whereas, which has kind of predisposed us to kind of either seek to adopt a command and control position over and above any other form of leadership or empowerment. But I was just talking to a chief executive of business just a couple of hours ago, and he was saying that he was turning to OKRs because he was wanting to build that alignment. He realized now that just a refreshed vision, mission, and values, and strategic priorities, and communicating those was not enough, because he's kind of, telling everybody what they are, and then just basically crossing his fingers and hoping that everybody has understood them and that can work out what their contribution should be. And that's a hell of a gamble. That's a hell of a risk. So yeah, it's all interesting. What have you seen in the way that, and this may be, from your time at Atlassian, or maybe even from before then, where organizations are using OKR and they've been making a couple of mistakes? I mean, I think you've maybe mentioned one of them, which is that, perhaps them kind of defaulting back to using them in a command and control style. But are there any other pitfalls which you've seen them, come a cropper on?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you make a really good point there, which I think we need to be aware of with these things. I think from a product perspective is you talk about conditioning. Is I think from a product perspective, we tend to think about things as we think everybody's kind of rational thinkers, and that, these things will kind of come naturally, or we're having these different conversations. But you're right. There's a lot of conditioning around. We seek certainty. We seek the right answer. So this is, I think, a lot of this, not just kind of OKRs themselves, but the conversations that surround them are, in an outcome focused conversations in an environment of extreme uncertainty is very uncomfortable. And that's kind of the starting place for sure. But as far as just some of kind of the common, I guess you could say, pitfalls that we've seen. I think one is just underestimating kind of the cultural side of things. And so I know this is kind of the common agility phrase for kind of the cultural aspect. And so I think if we kind of put it in an OKR framing, it's doing OKRs as opposed to being outcome focused kind of sums it up. And so I think is just one click zoom out from OKRs to thinking about what it means to be outcome focused, before even really digging into that. I think this is when, then you end up kind of seeing probably the symptom of that is really you just end up seeing status reports just switch from just projects and work to it's really just a status report, but it's OKRs. Right. So you still get some of those, I think Barry O'Reilly talks about some of the, the watermelons and things like that. Is you still get some of the same things. We're still essentially talking about outputs, or the KRs are just facades for outputs or things like that, which is really, I believe it's probably the start of just not kind of having that one click out to really think about what it means to be outcome focused. I think one, I think is really incredibly powerful when you get there, even just in pieces. But it's really, really tough to kind of let go and kind of give that autonomy, which is just really core to OKRs. And that's I know that's so hard to do. But I do think it really is the essence when all kinds of thought leaders in the space, et cetera, kind of talk about those dangers of cascading OKRs. And so when we talked about this is, orgs go and adopt OKRs, but they really still kind of solution at the higher levels of the organization. And so that, that bidirectional aspect, which is, learning kind of flowing up, just doesn't exist. And if there really isn't anything that's kind of challenging the beliefs that really just shaped those higher level goals or initiatives, then we're really just kind of susceptible to just like escalation of commitment and really just it ends up kind of being that the path is set for you, right? And decisioning really isn't happening at the fringes of the organization. I think and just probably just one more, I think not focusing enough on, really kind of what I would consider, and this is just from the perspective of, looking at organizations, especially from the perspective of kind of adopting software that they think is going to kind of help them build that scaffold. You know what I mean? And it's like you understand that that's like the perspective, right? That's going into it, right? And that's and I think there's an underlying there's trouble in that, right? That you kind of think that software is going to kind of bolt on and solve all your problems, et cetera. There's definitely help there. But I do think is that what ends up happening is you might go, bolt on some software and you really don't think about some of the first kind of milestones.
No, exactly.
I've seen organizations really get a lot of value out of, which is like, for example, just focusing on, the focus and alignment aspect of OKRs is incredibly powerful, right? You end up, it's like, no, we're going full-fledged OKRs and we're going to kind of, skip over like, the win there, right? That, that people kind of, if you were to ask anybody in the organization or kind of within the scope of a given OKR, you ask them the question as far as why are you doing this, that you can simply get that answer, right? Yeah. Is incredibly, powerful to start.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I mean, I get exasperated sometimes with the pushback that some executive teams can give on how much time they should be investing into, setting up and defining OKRs. It's like, but the alignment doesn't just happen when you start to share what you've created. The alignment starts in the conversations that you have around what you want to create.
Right.
You start getting, people start to make the connections and form ideas and articulate outcomes as they're having those discussions. If they're not part of those discussions, then they're presented with a fait accompli, which is, someone else's version of what success looks like. And I think it can be quite frustrating that at times. I think the lack of time, the lack of commitment, which executive C-suite level sometimes put into this.
Absolutely. Even to the point of, even just having different conversations for the first time, and just being able to kind of sit and experience that, right? Yeah. Before getting into the beautiful PowerPoint of what the entire rollout of OKRs is kind of going to look like, throughout the organization before, you've had that different conversation.
Yeah, exactly. So Atlassian obviously, had OKRs for themselves, I would expect, being one of the major software companies out there. Yep. Are you able to share with us a little bit about how Atlassian made use of them?
Yeah, for sure. What was interesting about Atlassian for me specifically was, prior to Atlassian, before we got acquired, we were a team of 50 some odd people. And so, we internally, it was much different for us than when it was the first time I was on the inside, I guess, of a larger organization, implementing OKRs and seeing it from a very different perspective than, you can imagine sitting in interviews and talking to various, customers, prospects, or just organizations we were researching around these things. I think that is honestly where I think you talk about it, but I think the real light bulb went off as far as how important culture is. I think Atlassian did a very good job when it came to OKRs because a lot of the culture just already existed.
Right.
And, I know that's just kind of a leg up, but if you think about, we would talk about companies all the time on kind of like these levels of these spectrums as far as even how open they are, or how they budgeted, or right, like all of those things actually have a major impact on how something like this is going to happen. I think within Atlassian is a very open company. I think it's a very collaborative company. It's you feel this even without OKRs. Like you feel this sense of alignment and purpose, and you can kind of draw the lines to impact. So I think Atlassian specifically, from a cultural perspective, was really kind of already there. And I think
I wonder if that's got something to do with the fact, I would imagine, that they would probably be heavy users of Agile beforehand.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think Atlassian is a very agile native kind of company. Is a naturally outcome oriented kind of company. It's funny talking about, you see everybody kind of talking about product led growth now, right? Like Atlassian the term wasn't used, but Atlassian was a very product led growth, naturally a PLG native kind of company. So you kind of have all of these things already in place that kind of helps, that the conversations are already being had. It's just that as the organization is growing, there kind of needs to be some structure in, just visibility in how everybody talks about those things the same way. Right. Mm-hmm. But those conversations were already happening. I would assume beforehand, Atlassian was already using OKRs when we came on board. I do think two things that were kind of pieces of that. One is that Atlassian is very focused on just team health in general. So I think that was very interesting as far as having a bunch of these, kind of internal playbooks around things as far as ways of working for different cross-functional groups. And also really dedicated on focusing on team health. That was much more general than, right. It was how teams kind of operate together and how cross teams operate together and kind of the psychology behind those things and kind of creating these environments of psychological safety. And right, like there was really kind of a whole piece of the org that was focused on that. And then the second one was that internally, there from kind of a program management perspective, is that mm-hmm. that team really, how OKRs is kind of used across the organization. When I say kind of speak the same language, I think that's the core of it, is that team was really focused on what that looks like from group to group. So the groups themselves don't really kind of have to, focus on, I don't know how things might be different kind of within smaller groups within the organization, but there's a layer of people that are, their main focus is really kind of getting the right people and the right information and having the right cadences around certain ceremonies in order to kind of keep everything flowing, and especially kind of on a rolling planning basis. So I think that group specifically is there are real humans that, kind of on the program management side, that do an incredible job of not only kind of structuring as far as really thinking, being very, very thoughtful about the best way that these frameworks and tools can work for Atlassian, and being open to adapting those things, which I thought was really profound, especially seeing it change and adapt, over time.
It's a visible investment in this, isn't it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Because when we do implementations, OKR implementations, we always, alongside the implementation, train up some internal OKR coaches, and they perform have very similar responsibilities to what you've just outlined there. They're the owners of the process, and if there's a system, they'll own the system as well. But and it's about making sure that that teams that are new to it get comfortable with it. Anybody coming to it for the first time maybe has some training. If teams are hitting a bit of a tricky patch, that they can kind of go in and support them through it, and so on and so forth. So there's it is about organizational processes don't just happen. There has to be something somewhere that. And I'm not a big fan of this word because it, for me, just implies a bit of rigidity. But there has to be some governance around it. But that governance doesn't have to be rigid. It can be flexible. It can be adaptable. if that's how you approach it. But the most important thing, right, is the investment in it, and that's really good to hear that they were demonstrably serious about it.
100%. It was an intentional investment, right? And I think, again, there's kind of a outcome driven approach to it. You naturally have a culture that Atlassian has been intentional about building, over the last 20 years, right? That all of those things help. And then kind of a very explicit investment, and especially with that team that's very thoughtful about, processes at Atlassian as a whole.
Okay. All right. Really interesting. So I'm going to jump on to my final question for you, Kyle. And that is, with all your years under your belt of working with OKRs, and in particular, I suppose I'm thinking about the time that you spent working with the clients that Atlassian had that were using OKRs. You've seen how large organizations have used them. So do you have a couple of hot takes to share with our listeners as to how large organizations could get the most out of OKRs?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with any of this, and especially working with all kinds of groups, again, from the perspective of kind of thinking about the role of product and how software can help solve some of these problems, is that over time I try to take the perspective of not necessarily that there's kind of this is right and this is wrong. I think for me, it was always an interesting position to be in, when you're on calls with customers, and when we had some incredible people internally within Atlassian and incredible partners, right? There's all sorts of great minds in this space that kind of help with this. But I always tried to, you always get the question, it's like, oh, what should we do? Right. So I was like, I don't know. So my hot takes, I think, are from the perspective of trying to think about some of the kind of deep rooted problems that these orgs are trying to solve, and and maybe not necessarily some of these things are kind of OKRs by the book, but we'll see if I get any hate mail. I think these are decently tame. So one is. And I think we touched on this a bit, is that there is an incredible amount of value in just having different conversations. And yeah. So, I question, whether if we're able to focus on having those different conversations first, are we having different conversations? Are people asking different questions? Does it feel different than, what these kind of just output driven status meetings kind of looked like in the past? I think that's a really big win. And so I think we see a lot of, or at least I saw a lot of orgs, and especially in a product, right? Because you kind of have the features, right? You can see them go for the features, and so many kind of force measuring so fast. And I think a lot of times there's some maturity that happens as far as like what you measure and how you think about measuring and investing in measuring as well. And I think a lot of times that can kind of create tunnel vision. I think there's that quote that, not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted.
Oh, I love that. I love that.
I think that's really interesting, just because I think there's really, if we think about kind of things that are valuable, we can get tunnel vision around the things that we're measuring without being able to kind of break that and be surprised by something. This is kind of like, if you've seen the classic, there's a YouTube video. I think there was actually a legitimate study that was done around this as well, where two teams are passing around a basketball, and a grizzly bear kind of comes across in the background, and people are asked to kind of count the passes. How many passes is this team making? And they don't even see this grizzly bear coming in the back. Right? It's this tunnel vision to say that if we're really focused on a lot of times suspiciously round numbers that we're measuring. Yeah. I think it can be hard to kind of break that. And so this is why, one of the things I found really interesting is even if there's to kind of say, well, what can you do about that? And this is where I don't think this is kind of really OKRs by the book, but I think scorecards are really, really interesting. If we think about the scores that we're giving, if we just kind of tell stories around those scores, where, this is what a 5 looks like, this is what a 7 looks like, et cetera. And you kind of tell a story, as opposed to measuring something. I honestly believe it's a really interesting start. Why? Because you're having different conversations around it. So I know there's different perspectives as far as saying, no, everything kind of has to be kind of measured. I've read, the book for how to measure anything. I think there's some really, really interesting things in there to say, like, no, you absolutely can measure, anything and everything. But it's difficult. I think a few others is I think and a big reason that I'm really interested in decision making and the intersection of all of these things, work and outcomes and strategy, et cetera. Is I think a lot of these conversations should really focus on the cycle time of decisions and less on kind of the progress towards the goal. I think we underestimate systems, and we tend to kind of see correlations where there aren't. And so, we're kind of like, we're doing things, and are they moving the needle? Right. I think we actually really do have a hard time really drawing kind of true correlation. And especially if success is really achieving the goal, then we're going to err on the side of, oh yeah, totally, this is kind of having an impact, when really it could be a moot investment. There's a great book, Thinking in Systems, Danella Meadows, and
right.
One of kind of the concepts as part of that is that we really underestimate, like, within systems, is that when we're pulling levers, is that we often have a completely adverse effect on what we're trying to impact. And so I think a lot of these concepts get back to, if we're focused on the cycle time of things that we're going to learn, or something we might be surprised on, as far as making a decision to continue something or pivot off of it, that's a really interesting focus. If we think about the goal itself as, we're kind of moving on this spectrum of time, and we need to understand if we're getting closer or further away from the future, the outcome that we want.
Yeah.
I think we also need to think about just OKRs kind of as a framework to kind of quit things, more so than a framework to achieve things. And so it's kind of along the same lines. So, these are kind of hot takes.
Well, they did often say that strategy is more about what you say no to than what you actually do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of focus on kind of achieving the goals, as opposed to, saying, well, how does, when we talk about this OKR and we talk about the hypothesis that we have this hypothesis, we believe, if this is true, we're going to see this outcome as measured by, right? If that's the framing, then that should really give us a pretty incredible framing for how we make decisions around the things that we're doing to achieve that. And, as humans, we're pretty bad at two things, which is, predicting what's going to happen, and then abandoning things that are just clearly not providing the expected value that we thought. And so I think if we were better at both those things, that's a really incredible strategic advantage, right? And I think OKRs are an incredibly powerful piece of that puzzle to drive that conversation, because they tell us, where we are and where we want to go with a definition of success, and and what we'll see when we get there or we get close to it. Yeah. But I think that the thing is with goals, and Annie Duke, she has a new book called Quit that kind of actually specifically dives into this subject. She talks about, right, that goals should come with a warning sign that says high chance for escalation of commitment. And so I think a lot of times we don't really put the mechanisms in place to avoid that.
Yeah. Kyle, absolutely fascinating listening to what you have to say. I think we need to round off in a minute, but if I may just ask, what's next for you? Obviously, you've moved on from Atlassian. What are you able to share with us about what you're doing next?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, my time, at AgileCraft and Atlassian, and working with large organizations and just kind of general ways of working, and specifically being really interested in this transition for, outcome-driven organizations and OKRs specifically, is that I believe OKRs are incredibly powerful. We saw these different conversations happening. What I do think is kind of, more recently to think about them as this, among other things, is kind of scaffolding for how we make decisions within organizations. OKRs drive investment decisions and decisions around, whether we pivot or persevere on those investments, kind of based on what we've learned and how that's kind of updated our predictions and updated our beliefs. And so, as my kind of shameless plug is I'm really interested in, with the community. I do think when we think about some of these frameworks and tools and models, is I'm really interested in something that's a bit more community driven, from kind of practitioners that are actually in organizations that can actually kind of test these things with teams. And so right now, I'm really focused on, there's a ton of research out there, some incredible tools and frameworks from thought leaders in this space. And we're focused on kind of aggregating and bringing a lot of those models and frameworks together, and then having a community to go kind of put these pieces together into something that, can kind of be a launching point for organizations. So it's called the Blueprint. The URL is really decisions.community. And what we're doing is building a community just to think about these things and how some of these, cognitive biases and these tools and models that have been developed, through research can actually be implemented with teams. And
how can I sign up? Because I'd love to be part of this, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners would like to be as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The URL is it's decisions.community. And so if you just type that in, you'll see it come up. And it's called the Blueprint. So right now we'll be opening up kind of the community in general in February. So we just have an email sign up there right now. And for anybody, I've been doing kind of a ton of interviews kind of on this subject, and so would love to chat with anybody. But if you sign up, you'll see some emails come out from me.
Okay, all right, no problem. Well, for listeners, the URL will be in the show notes, along with a link to your LinkedIn as well. Kyle, I've really enjoyed this. Thank you. I hope our listeners have enjoyed it as much as I have. And, a huge thank you for taking the time to talk to us. You've had some really great experiences and insights along the way, and it's great to hear you share those.
Yeah, this was great, Roger. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no problem. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and I shall be back in the not too distant future with another episode of Giant Talk. So stay tuned and see you then.